Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the latest on the counter-ISIS campaign. Actually speaking to you now from Erbil, where we just concluded a conference with a group of participants from all around the world that discussed the future of Northeast Syria. Joining me today is Michael Stevens. What's your title these days, Mike?
I'm Research Fellow for Middle East Studies. I've been that for, I think, about 5 years now.
So. That's okay. I've known you for a very long time. Yeah. And for listeners, we are recording this on my iPhone, and we both have colds, so there could be some coughing in the background. But let's just start right there. I mean, we've sort of reached this point where the conflict lines in Syria have gone static, leading to questions about what the future of the counter-ISIS campaign will be, what the future policy is. So why don't you give us your thoughts on all that?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that this has been repeated almost ad nauseum now, that the military aspects of the conflict against ISIS are winding up, and a lot of the activity and deployments from Western forces in particular are sort of decreasing, and I think that's sort of job well done. That's the first tick. As we, look out the window, we can see, American planes flying around the sky here. So, there's obviously still things going on. But in terms of the sort of immediacy of the problem, I think it's faded, but we're in a situation now where there's starting to be some more of the long-term strategic thinking coming through. And I think that both in London, where I'm from, and in the United States, a lot of that thinking was done in the latter part of last year about what the sort of timelines for this would be. And actually what it seems to be is open-ended. I think what's increasingly becoming clear is that actually ISIS are a lot more resilient than people thought, in terms of numbers, but also in terms of their ability to infiltrate into populations across Iraq and Syria, and frankly change the way that they operate, and moving towards what you might call a more classic style insurgency.
Yeah, so as one of the sort of the three coalition members of the Defeat ISIS coalition that has troops on the ground, so it's the US, the UK, and the French. Could you give us a sense, maybe, because the Rusi office is very close to Whitehall, like sort of the shock of the Trump administration decision to rapidly withdraw and then sort of reverse course into this position of a phased drawdown eventually to 400 troops split between the Northeast and the US base at Tanaf?
Sure. Well, so the Brits got roughly a week's warning before the announcement was made public. So we knew it was coming. I don't think many people appreciated a week before Christmas that it was going to be done, because it had such serious strategic implications. And I think immediately from the moment that we in Britain found out about this, we tried and I think continuously messaged the Americans, and had been doing so for the last 2 or 3 years, to kind of temper their ambitions and to say, look, this is a much longer term problem than perhaps your political timelines are willing to accept. So there was frustration. I think there's no doubt in our minds that there was frustration, and very quickly, as I would say, probably your closest ally in the region, particularly in terms of security operations, we had to state our position, which was that we disagreed with what the United States was saying. It wasn't that we disagreed with the Pentagon or we disagreed with the State Department, but we did disagree with the executive, and I think that we messaged to that effect, both in public and in private. And I think it was something that took us by surprise. We didn't expect it, and frankly speaking, where we're at now in the middle of 2019 is a better place. I think that the sort of, how should you say, the attention span of the president has been mitigated, and actually the sort of more deeper thinking people with familiarity of the region and of the challenges in the region are now in charge of the policy. Meanwhile, the president has whatever fight he's picking down on the southern border with Mexico, or whatever else he's doing with the Mueller report. So from our perspective, things are in a much better place. We're, of course, happy to back up whatever the United States wants to do in northeastern Syria. We've made that very clear since 2016 that that is our policy. And we would definitely be, I think, as Great Britain, happy to play a role alongside the Americans and the French, perhaps the Australians as well, in forming some sort of security architecture, if you like, in northeastern Syria that is resilient against ISIS and will, for years to come, provide some sort of framework for stabilization in the area. I think the thing that we're less interested in is this whole counter-Iran debate. It's just not something that we're really that interested by. It doesn't affect our politics in the way it affects your politics. And frankly, northeastern Syria, yes, it could be an area in which Iran could be contained. And certainly I think, London's view is that Iranian expansion should be contained. I'm just not sure how connected the Northeast is to that policy. So I think we need to see a little bit more detail on what that counter-Iran policy looks like. But I think what the thinking in London is very much that this is a counter-terrorism issue and a stabilization issue and not a more sort of geostrategic issue.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that came out in the conference is sort of one of the big questions, like how do you deal with, what is essentially, what is an enclave in the Northeast that is outside of the control of the central regime in Syria, and then the central regime in Syria having Russian in particular backing, but also Iranian backing, is how do you weave in either a peace agreement, a de-escalation agreement, a deconfliction agreement, whatever you want to call it, when you have conflicting points of view about the future of Assad and how the state should be structured. What do you think we should be looking at in terms of your government's policy on the future of Bashar? Because a lot of people want to accept him or at least try and move on, but there's a lot of resistance in both our capitals to any idea of that.
Yeah, and I think that remains to this day. Look, as early as 2016, you had people in Paris, London, Berlin, Washington saying, at some point we're going to have to talk to Bashar al-Assad. The guy's winning. And I think since the fall of Aleppo in December 2016, that was very much a realistic prospect. And then, of course, you had the use of chemical weapons in the spring of 2017, which completely put a derailer on anybody inside Western governments that was talking about engagement. Because there was a moment in which, following the use of chemical weapons, that an opportunity was seen to drive a wedge between Moscow and Damascus and to peel Moscow away. But that hasn't worked. And ultimately, Trump's decision to send a few cruise missiles in, it was a statement, and it was actually quite an effective statement in a way, but it didn't translate into a policy. So actually where we're at now, 2 years later, almost to the day, is a situation in which, Bashar al-Assad's won this war, with the exception of a small pocket of Turkish-backed fighters in the northwest and the Syrian Kurdish enclave in the northeast. So effectively what we've got is, as you said, three static areas who are backed by very powerful states, with air forces, and they define the boundary lines inside Syria. So at some point, people are going to have to talk. And I think there's two layers to this. There's obviously the kind of SDF, YPG, whatever you want to call it, discussion with Syrian Arab Republic, and how they work out their differences, how they deconflict in terms of military and the day-to-day de-escalation. Then there's the larger political conversation about whether we look at some sort of program for autonomy, federalization, confederalization, which I don't think Turkey would ever accept. And I think that's the big conundrum here, actually, is the fact that Turkey, the NATO ally, would be very unhappy with any of these types of political conversations. So ultimately, there needs to be a clearer position from Damascus about what it is that they would accept, and also from the Kurds. But of course, they're playing chicken with each other. They don't want to give their positions away. They're both holding to maximalist views on their wishes for a future Syria. As for the sort of Turkish-backed northwest, I think that's much more unclear, because there could still be military operations there. Iran and Russia could get involved if deconfliction with Turkey doesn't work. So from I think, looking at it from London's perspective, obviously, it goes without saying we're a bit distracted by Brexit. We don't have a lot of bandwidth to think about these things. And of course, in DC, you also have your own political challenges. So we probably wouldn't get too deeply involved in what that settlement would look like. We would very much like the Americans to take the lead on it. But if that doesn't happen, I think playing reactiveness, sort of reactive policies, is the best way. Ultimately, with forces on the ground in northeastern Syria, there is a bargaining chip to play with. The question is what it looks like. And I think you and I both know that because of the YPG's links to the PKK, which both our countries have listed as a terrorist organization, it's difficult for us to make political guarantees. And we've not done that.
Yeah, no, and I think that's the big... And the other big player that was discussed a lot in this conference was Russia, and what Russia wants out of the conflict, and perhaps, how they could be either enlisted or pressured to put pressure on their client, Bashar al-Assad, to try and make concessions around, what we can discuss about academically, which is decentralization, how that ever is defined, federalism, political autonomy, cultural autonomy for the Kurdish enclave. But ultimately this will have to include talks with the Russians, and the Russians seem to be, if I had to take a look at how their position has shifted, because they've gotten so down the rabbit hole with the Turks on the northwest, is that they actually aren't as amenable to political compromise, or at least their positions are not as amenable, the Northeast Kurds, as they were perhaps at the outset of their intervention in 2015. Sure. Yeah. They've swung a little harder to the Turkish position, and I think that's largely as a result of their efforts to try and establish a rival political process to that in Geneva, which the U.S. and the major Western powers are backing. So, how is Russia sort of trying to manage this back and forth of this conflict, and where do you think they're going?
Well, there's a basic fact here, right, which is that if you want to see an agreement in Syria, you're going to have to go through Moscow at some point. In that respect, it a little bit reminds me of the Balkans, where the Russians became very active towards the end, and actually to get any sort of peace with the Serbs, you actually had to have Moscow kind of using its leverage on that conflict as well. So the question that you've got is, to what extent is Moscow willing to push forward some sort of constitutional frameworks and amendments, which they have tried before, right? In 2016 and 17, they were presenting draft constitutions to Bashar al-Assad, who was rejecting them, which allowed for things like greater Kurdish autonomy. And effectively, I think, let's be honest, from this conference, what was clear from the Russian position was that leverage isn't really there anymore.
Or they're not willing to use it.
Or they're not willing to use it. Certainly their leverage over the Kurds is gone post the Operation Olive Branch operations in early 2018. That's the Afrin operations. Actually, their position on the grand bargain with, Rojava or the Kurds and the regime is pretty weak. Because ultimately, anything north of the Euphrates is kind of American territory. And so the US has to bring leverage in and kind of a guiding hand. Now, one thing I think that we need to be careful of, because it sounds a little bit imperialist, is to sort of say, well, the only way that it can be a peace agreement in Syria is to have, Moscow and DC sit down and work it out. Sort of Cold War style. I think it's more complicated than that, partly because of Turkey, but also because the actors on the ground have their own efficacy. But at some point, there is a certain truth to this, which is actually that somebody from DC and somebody from Moscow will have to work out what they can accept. That comes back to the point I was making about the political calculation from the Americans. What is it? Because when it came to Brett McGurk, which I'm going to be honest, now that he's out of office, he wasn't very popular in London. When it came to Brett McGurk, it was kicking the can down the road in the notion that, counterterrorism operations came first and we didn't have to think about the politics. Now we have to think about the politics. The front lines are static. There's no more fighting to be done. Well, we would hope that there's no more fighting to be done along the Euphrates River Valley, particularly between Assad SDF. Maybe there'd be some stuff in the northwest. But Russia is part of this equation. The question is, what is Russia's leverage? This is a massive conundrum to me, because if you look historically, at Moscow or the USSR's leverage on Hafez al-Assad, it was always quite limited. I mean, Hafez was always a troublesome ally, right? And there's been much documentation about this, that Damascus was never the sort of pliant client, right, that Moscow wanted from some of its other allies, perhaps in the Central Asian and the Stans. So the question is, what will Bashar al-Assad accept? Will he accept a solution imposed upon him? And the answer is absolutely not. Hezb al-Ba'ath, or the Ba'ath Party, believe that all of Syria is theirs. Now, there is division inside. You have sort of softer lines from Walid Mu'allim and people like that. And then you have the tougher lines from the sort of, the Air Force intelligence types. They haven't made their mind up what they want, but ultimately it comes down to what Bashar is willing to accept. The Russians can't impose that on him. And the Americans can't impose on Russia to then impose on Assad either. So there's sort of two layers to this. And if the Kurds want to fight with the regime and the regime wants to fight with the Kurds, that will happen. The question is, how can it be prevented from escalating to the point where, DC's ally and, Moscow's ally are not so badly affected that Daesh pops up again or Al-Qaeda pops up again. That's where we're at. In terms of the shape of a political agreement, as I said before, Moscow has tried several times to fashion an agreement, which has been rejected. I don't see why at this stage they would be able to do anything different.
I think one of the other things that came up in the conference also on top of this was all in every conversation, Turkey was also mentioned as both a potential enabler of a political settlement, but also a potential spoiler because of, you can't get around it, is that, the core component of the U.S. ground force in Syria, the Syrian Democratic Forces, is the YPG. The YPG is, without question, the Syrian branch of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is an insurgent movement that uses terrorist tactics in Turkey to achieve political aims, and has been listed, as you mentioned earlier, by both our governments and Turkey, and I believe the European Union as a whole, as a terrorist organization. And so Turkey obviously would like to see the YPG politically sidelined, if not politically destroyed and militarily destroyed, and has sought to engage Moscow towards this effort, right? At different levels as a mechanism to undermine the United States, which has emerged as the SDF's primary backer. So we also can't get around the fact that Turkey controls area in the north, and will want to say too in how this settlement will play out. I mean, you've spent some time in the Northeast. I mean, what would you say the Kurdish on the ground reaction is to any sort of political compromises with the Turks?
Very hesitant, very wary. I think in PKK or YPG's calculation, there is only one existential threat. That existential threat remains Ankara, who they blame as being responsible for pretty much everything, all the way down to the creation of ISIS. How much of that is true or not is up for debate, of course. It is an atavistic hostility, right? This is a conflict which has been going on since the 70s, which many of the people at the top of the PYD and the YPG grew up learning about, and indeed fighting in, and training for. Now that, of course, there is a political project which is uniquely Syrian, doesn't necessarily change that DNA. So they are practical. In my own conversations with people in the PYD, I think they've acknowledged that, Western countries viewed Turkey as a NATO ally. I mean, there are some problems now in terms of Turkey's role as a NATO ally, but they still are, and that actually, we prefer backing states. We respect the interest of states. British foreign policy is all about the rules-based order at the moment, right, in reaction to the fraying global norms that are happening in the much wider context. If we start sort of creating states like we did in 1900s, today, that is not the rules-based international order. So there is no way that we're going to sit there and be encouraging sort of states to pop up all over the world. We are sitting in Iraqi Kurdistan right now. Both your government and my government fiercely opposed any attempt by the Kurdistan regional government to become independent. my ambassador and your ambassador were the two people that actually delivered the documents to Barzani and said, listen, there is another way. And then, of course, when Barzani didn't go down that path, we, I'm afraid to say, had to accept that Turkey and Iran were going to do what they were going to do to shut off Kurdish independence in this area. So if that happened in 2017 in Iraqi Kurdistan, who we both consider an ally and a legitimate actor backed through the Iraqi constitution, how can we do that in northeastern Syria? The question in my mind is, I think clearly Turkey's concerns have to be ameliorated in some way. I'm afraid things like the Manbij roadmap were not enough. Turkey wants to see a complete release of control by the United States of the YPG. Now, I would say my government has been playing at the edges. We have tightened our belts vis-a-vis the PKK operating in our own country and across Europe. We have been more strident in our positions to try and roll back PKK activity. But to do what? To create a dividing line between the PKK and the YPG so that we have more diplomatic wiggle room.
Right? Yeah, same. Yeah.
But the Turks aren't interested in this.
They don't care. No.
Right? It's the same shade of grey to them.
That's right.
Shade
of red, I would say. It's not even grey. Yeah. There's no grey.
Exactly. It's black. Well, in fact, yes, it's black and
white.
For them, it's all black. For us, it's multiple shades of grey.
There you go. That's
Yebeshe, Pejak, all these things. So the truth of the matter is that we're doing what Britain was always very good at, which is not quite saying what we actually mean.
That's very, 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 very true to culture.
Yeah. And the Turks aren't interested in that. So ultimately, they are a key spoiler. Having said that, I think I'm sticking my neck out here. If Turkey looked like they were going to mobilize into northeastern Syria, I think there would be a huge amount of diplomatic activity to prevent it.
I do too. But I'm not sure it would work. I mean, so the idea is that you try and bring them into the sort of proposed Trump safe zone in ways that you could both mollify the SDF leadership and appease Turkey. I'm just not sure that that is something that's actually feasible, despite the best ever efforts of my government to try and make this work. To present a plan to the Syrian Kurds for a limited Turkish presence in the northeast, guaranteed by the U.S. to ensure that there's no, let's say, errant rifle fire. And then on the other side to the Turks is that the U.S. would guarantee some sort of semblance of border security to the Turks, perhaps through observation points that would assuage Ankara that there won't be cross-border attacks by the YPG. This is a tall order and likely to fail, but nevertheless, diplomacy is about meetings, and keeping up dialogue is never a bad thing. But I mean, as we pivot to the end here and sort of the final thing, where does this end? And I know because we didn't come to a conclusion on this at the conference.
No.
Of course we couldn't, despite having a bunch of smart people in the room. And prediction is often folly, and you look silly, especially when you record it.
Yeah.
But our countries will not be in the Northeast forever.
No.
So what's the end game here, if we had to take a stab at it?
Well, I just want to say one thing first, which is that to some extent, Russia, the Europeans, America, Turkey, have all owned a part of this conflict and ceded control over other parts of the conflict. In 2013, after the use of chemical weapons in Ghouta by Bashar al-Assad, my government rejected the use of military force. Yours then followed suit. I think it was a convenient excuse for Obama. But we effectively, at that point, ceded control over the debate about Damascus, which we have never controlled since. And we've lost that debate. Let us admit it. Now, the Turks also, at that point, began to lose because they, first of all, lost what they had, which was a regime change policy in Damascus, but also it was the emergence of the Kurds. Now, you have to accept, if you are Ankara or if you are Washington, D.C., or if you are Moscow, that if you do not put your money where your mouth is at certain points in the conflict, you do not own that part of the conflict. Ankara has to take some blame for the fact that the moment for them in which they lost control over the Syrian Kurdish issue was Kobani in August 2014. They sat on the border and they did very, very little. And as a result, you had a huge outpouring of Kurdish nationalism. And you got the movement in the West towards seeing the YPG as the good guys. That's questionable how people approach that particular issue. Ankara has been struggling to keep up since. Just like we have been struggling to keep up with the Astana process, where we look through a porthole and we have no control. Ankara has no control over the SDF issue. So everybody's going to have to accept that there are parts of Syria which end up looking like what they never wanted. But welcome to Syria. This is an 8-year-old conflict in which nobody wins. Nobody wins. And at some point, people are going to have to be a little bit more sensible about how they perceive their favoured political outcomes. Ankara is in a much better position than it was in 2016. They have a strip of territory going from Jarablus all the way across to Idlib, which they control. They have border security there. Very questionable who the people in that area are, but nevertheless they have that. It is a bargaining chip. They can use it to try and pressure the United States on the YPG. They can use the S-400 issue to pressure the United States on the YPG. But ultimately, Erdogan, ever the pragmatist who entered into negotiations with the PKK before all of this, will need to accept that there will be an outcome in Syria which is not Turkey's favoured outcome. We will also have to accept that. By the way, we do, because Bashar al-Assad is the president of the Syrian Arab Republic. We've kind of had to accept it, right? The question for us is that actually Bashar al-Assad is not an existential threat for Britain or the United States. PKK and Northeast Syria for Turkey might be. So there will be rumblings. You asked me to look forward and say what I suggest. I think there will be permanent instability on that border. I think that, given the strength of the latent ISIS threat, both in Iraq and Syria, we will be there longer than you think. This will outlast the Trump presidency. It will outlast Brexit. These are permanent security challenges. We have in my country over 1,000 people that joined ISIS. This is really serious. It had huge impact in Britain in 2017, where we suffered 5 terrorist attacks. There is a latent threat from the reemergence of ISIS. So from our perspective, and I think you guys are a little bit more protected because you have 3,000 miles of water.
Yeah, we're a little different.
Yeah, but for us, I'm afraid to say, I think that we would not accept the collapse of a political order in Northeast Syria because it represents such an existential problem for us. The other issue, of course, is the Al-Hol refugee camp. 60,000 members of ISIS or ISIS families there. Lots of social questions to be decided. Everybody's playing for time. While that camp is there, I cannot foresee a situation in which Western countries, Germany, France, the Italians, the United States, Canada, Australia, of course, who has problems with ISIS fighters, just sitting there and saying, it's okay for the SDF to collapse. No, it's not okay. That presents a threat to us which is intolerable. Turkey rightly is frustrated and angry about that, but ultimately, we have to look after our interests too. I alluded to it before that we would be, I think, in Europe very happy to work against PKK recruitment activity, funding activity that is happening. It may not keep Turkey, completely happy, but I go back to my original point. Nothing that emerges in Syria will make everybody happy. Sorry, that's just the way it is. It's 8 years of war, nobody wins.
Yeah, it's like the Rolling Stones song, you can't always get what you want, but sometimes you get what you need, right?
Yeah.
So I think with that, we can close this podcast out. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for letting us use your room. You have the better view than mine. I look at the wrong way of Erbil. You look downtown, and it's a much nicer view. And we get to see airplanes flying in and out, as well as American helicopters.
We do, yes. So I hope it doesn't need to be like this forever, but my suspicion is that it might be.
Yeah, so with that, thank you, Michael, for joining me, and thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks.